It started on a Tuesday, the kind of crisp, fog-heavy autumn morning that makes you glad you spent your life savings on 5 acres of nothing but trees, dirt, and silence. Or at least that's what I told myself as I stood on the front porch, wrapping my hands around a hot mug of black coffee and staring down the gravel driveway at the only thing standing between me and the rest of the world, my gate. It wasn't anything fancy, just a heavy-duty, custom-welded iron beast I'd installed myself about 3 years back, mostly to keep the coyotes out and my 2 labs, Buster and Hank, from wandering off to chase deer into the next county. But little did I know that hunk of metal was about to become the main character in the most absurd, headache-inducing, and ultimately satisfying drama I have ever witnessed in my 50 years on this planet. I was just taking a sip, enjoying the way the mist clung to the pines, when I saw it. A bright red SUV tearing down the county road like it was qualifying for NASCAR, only to screech to a halt right in front of my property, and out stepped a woman I knew only by reputation. Let's call her Brenda, the self-appointed queen bee of the Whispering Pines subdivision that had popped up next to my land like a bad rash about a year ago. Brenda wasn't just a neighbor. She was the president of their HOA, the head of the architectural review committee, and the kind of person who probably measured her own lawn with a ruler at 3 a.m. just to make sure the grass blades were complying with regulations. And as she marched up to my gate, clutching a clipboard like a weapon of mass destruction, I knew my peace and quiet had just packed its bags and left town. She didn't knock on the gate, if you can even do that. Instead, she grabbed the bars and rattled them, screaming something that got lost in the wind. So I sighed, put my coffee down on the railing, and walked down the long drive to meet her, feeling that heavy pit in my stomach that tells you your day is about to go sideways. When I got within earshot, I didn't even get a good morning or a hello. She just pointed a manicured finger at my face and yelled that the gate was an abomination, a violation of the community aesthetic, and that I needed to remove it immediately because it was hindering her right to free passage. Now, you have to understand the geography here because it's crucial to the insanity that followed. My land is old family property, grandfathered in way before the developers bought the adjacent lot and put up their cookie-cutter mansions. And while Brenda had a perfectly good, paved, two-lane exit on the other side of her subdivision that led to the highway, my driveway was an old logging route that technically connected to the back of her cul-de-sac, but it had been private property since 1974. I looked at her, blinking slowly, trying to process the sheer audacity of a woman standing on the wrong side of a property line telling me what to do with my own steel, and I explained calmly, perhaps too calmly, that she wasn't in the HOA, I wasn't in the HOA, and this gate wasn't moving unless God himself came down with a wrench. Brenda didn't like that. Her face turned a shade of crimson that matched her SUV, and she started flipping through papers on her clipboard, citing bylaws and statutes that applied to the people who paid dues to her little club, not to a guy like me who just wanted to grow tomatoes and be left alone. And she dropped the bombshell that really kicked this whole thing off. She claimed that because the main exit of their subdivision was undergoing beautification repairs for the next month, she had designated my driveway as the official emergency detour for the residents, specifically for herself, because it shaved 10 minutes off her commute to the yoga studio. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was a dry, incredulous chuckle that seemed to offend her more than any insult could have, and I told her that while I sympathized with her commute, my property wasn't a public highway, and if she wanted a detour, she could drive the 3 miles around the lake like everyone else. That was the moment the war started, right there in the gravel, because Brenda wasn't used to hearing the word no. She was used to bullying contractors and terrifying young mothers about the color of their curtains. So she puffed up her chest and told me that she demanded I unlock the gate right now, or she'd call the sheriff and have me arrested for unlawful imprisonment of a community leader. I told her to go ahead, crossed my arms, and leaned against the limestone pillar of the gate, watching as she fumbled for her phone, dialed 911, which I'm sure the dispatchers loved, and proceeded to put on a performance worthy of an Academy Award, sobbing into the receiver that she was being held hostage by a hostile man with a barricade, completely omitting the fact that she could literally just turn her car around and drive away the way she came. While we waited for the law to arrive, she didn't stop. She kept pacing back and forth, muttering about how I was a rustic savage, holding back the progress of the neighborhood, and how property values were going to tank because of my prison aesthetic. oblivious to the fact that my gate was worth more than her landscaping budget for the year. When Deputy Miller rolled up, a good man I've known since high school, looking tired already, he took one look at the scene, me leaning on the post, Brenda hyperventilating near her bumper, and the gate firmly locked, and he just shook his head, stepping out of the cruiser with the heavy sigh of a man who didn't get paid enough for suburban disputes. Brenda rushed him, grabbing his arm, dragging him toward the gate like she was showing him a murder scene, screaming that I was blocking emergency access and that he needed to cut the lock immediately. But Miller just pulled his arm away and asked the magic question, "Ma'am, is your car broken?" She blinked, confused, and said no. So he pointed behind her to the open road leading back to her house and said, "Then you aren't trapped, are you? You're just inconvenienced." And the look on her face was priceless, a mixture of shock and rage, as if the concept of logic was a foreign language she refused to learn. Miller turned to me, checked my permits, which I keep handy for exactly this kind of nonsense, confirmed everything was legal, and then told Brenda that if she called 911 again for a non-emergency, she'd be the one getting a citation, not me. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? You'd think a rational person would go home, drink some herbal tea, and realize they were being ridiculous. But Brenda wasn't rational. She was motivated by a deep, hollow need for control, and I had just become the one thing she couldn't control, so instead of retreating, she dug in. The next morning, I woke up to find a drone hovering over my front yard, buzzing like an angry hornet, and when I looked down the drive, there was Brenda standing on the roof of her SUV with a controller, filming my property, shouting that she was documenting code violations to present to the county board. I didn't shoot the drone down, though the thought crossed my mind and my trigger finger itched. Instead, I just waved at the camera and went about my chores. But the harassment escalated quickly. She started holding vigils at the gate with two of her friends, women who looked like carbon copies of her, but with less energy, holding signs that said "Tear down the wall" and "Community Unity," which was ironic considering they were alienating the only neighbor who owned a tractor and a chainsaw, tools that come in handy when trees fall in winter storms. She filed complaints with every department she could find: animal control because my dogs barked at squirrels, the EPA claiming my compost pile was a biohazard, and even the fire marshal, insisting my gate was a fire trap. But every inspector who came out took one look at my well-maintained land, drank a cup of my coffee, had a laugh about the crazy lady next door, and left without issuing a single fine. But Brenda, she had one card left to play, or at least she thought she did. And this is where the story takes a turn that I almost feel guilty enjoying. Almost. She decided to sue, or rather, she decided to petition the county to revoke my ownership of the strip of land the gate sat on, claiming that based on a map she found from 1950, it was actually a public easement that had been illegally absorbed into my deed, and she marched into the county clerk's office with a swagger that suggested she had already won, demanding a full survey and title investigation to prove that I was squatting on public land. I received the notice in the mail a week later, and I won't lie, I was nervous for a minute because land records in rural areas can be messy. Scribbles on napkins from 80 years ago sometimes hold up in court, so I hired my own surveyor, an old guy named Pete who's been measuring dirt since the Nixon administration, and I told him to find the truth, whatever it was. Pete spent 3 days out there with his lasers and tripods, digging through dusty archives in the courthouse basement, while Brenda stood on her side of the property line, arms crossed, smirking like the cat that ate the canary, asking Pete every hour if he had found the evidence of my theft yet. On the fourth day, Pete knocked on my door, took off his hat, and laid a large map out on my kitchen table, looking at me with a twinkle in his eye that I'll never forget. And he said, "Jack, you're going to want to sit down for this, and maybe pour yourself a stiff drink, because what I found is going to make your day, your week, and probably your whole year." It turned out Brenda was right about one thing. There was an error in the property lines, a massive clerical mistake dating back to when the subdivision was first platted out by a developer who cut corners, but the error wasn't about my gate. The survey revealed that the developer had built the cul-de-sac in the last 50 feet of Brenda's driveway, the only paved access to her house, on a forgotten parcel of land that was never transferred to the HOA, never transferred to her, and legally, according to the original 1920 logging deed I held, belonged to me. Let me repeat that for the people in the back. My gate wasn't on public land, but her driveway, her rose bushes, and about 10 feet of her front porch were sitting squarely on my property. I stared at the map, tracing the red line that cut right through her manicured existence, and a slow grin spread across my face, the kind of grin that scares people, because the tables hadn't just turned, they had flipped over and smashed through the floorboards. I didn't rush over there screaming. No, I played the long game, waiting for the official certified letter from the county to arrive at her house, the one that would explain that her property was legally landlocked and that she was technically trespassing every time she pulled her car into her garage. I was in the garden pruning the hydrangeas when I heard the scream. It was a primal sound, like a banshee realizing it had lost its voice, and I looked up to see Brenda storming out of her house, paper clutching in her shaking hand, running toward the fence line where I was working. "This is a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. "You bribed them. You paid them off. This is my land. I bought it. I own it." I just leaned on my hoe, pushed my hat back, and said, "Well, actually, Brenda, you bought the house, but it looks like you forgot to check who owned the dirt underneath the driveway. And according to the county, that's me, which puts us in a bit of a pickle, doesn't it?" She tried to argue, tried to threaten, tried to say she'd take it to the Supreme Court, but the reality was setting in like wet concrete. She had poked the bear, and the bear turned out to own the forest. The county sent a cease and desist order regarding her use of the driveway until a resolution could be reached, effectively trapping her car in her garage unless she wanted to drive illegally across my land, which, given her previous stance on property rights, was a delicious irony. But here is where I tried to be the bigger man. I really did. I went to her the next day and offered a solution. A simple easement agreement. I told her I would grant her legal access to the driveway for a nominal fee of $1 a year, provided she signed a document acknowledging my ownership, dropped all the complaints against my gate, and, this was the kicker, wrote a formal letter of apology to me and the sheriff's department for wasting our time. It was a golden ticket, a way out with her dignity mostly intact. All she had to do was humble herself for 10 seconds and sign the paper. She looked at the document, looked at me, and ripped it in half, throwing the pieces in my face like confetti, screaming that she would never apologize to a tyrant, and that she would find another way, that she didn't need my charity and would bulldoze a new path if she had to. I just watched the paper flutter to the grass, sighed, and said, "Have it your way, Brenda," before turning back to my house, locking the gate. My gate, her only potential legal exit, behind me with a satisfying click. The next 2 weeks were a descent into madness that would have made a psychiatrist quit his job. Brenda, unable to use her driveway legally and too stubborn to sign the agreement, started parking her car on the main road and walking a quarter-mile through the muddy woods to get to her house, ruining her designer shoes in the process. She tried to hire a contractor to pour a new driveway on the other side of her lot, but the county denied the permit because it was designated wetlands. Another fact she would have known if she paid attention to anything other than her own ego. She became a pariah in her own kingdom. The neighbors she used to terrorize started waving at me when they drove by, giving me thumbs up, stopping to chat about the weather, asking how the situation was going with a wink and a nudge, because everyone loves seeing a bully get a taste of their own medicine. But Brenda wasn't done. She was cornered, desperate, and losing her grip on reality. And that's when she decided to launch the Midnight Raid, a plan so ill-conceived it sounded like something out of a bad cartoon. It was 2 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday when my motion sensors tripped, lighting up the monitors in my bedroom like a Christmas tree, and I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and looked at the screen to see 2 figures in dark raincoats struggling with a pair of bolt cutters at my gate. It was Brenda and her husband, a quiet man named Ted who usually looked like he was apologizing for his wife's existence. And he looked miserable, soaking wet, trying to cut through a hardened steel chain that I guarantee was stronger than his marriage. I didn't call the police immediately. I just flipped the switch for the floodlights I had installed the week before. 10,000 lumens of pure daylight that blinded them instantly, catching them like deer in headlights. Brenda dropping the bolt cutters with a clang that echoed through the valley. I spoke through the intercom system, my voice booming out of the speaker like the voice of God. "Ted, go home. Brenda, smile for the camera. You're on the cloud now." Ted ran, He literally abandoned her and sprinted back toward the trees, leaving Brenda standing there, squinting into the light, defiant to the end, flipping the bird at the camera before turning and stomping away into the mud. I called Deputy Miller in the morning, handed over the footage, and by noon, Brenda was being served with charges for attempted destruction of property and trespassing, and the look on her face when the cruiser pulled up, not to help her this time, but to book her, was the end of the first act of her downfall. The court date was the climax of this tragic comedy. The courtroom was packed because word had gotten around town, and people treated it like the social event of the season. Brenda represented herself, of course, because no lawyer in town would take her case after seeing the survey maps, and she stood before Judge Holloway, a stern woman with zero patience for nonsense, and tried to argue that my floodlights caused her emotional distress and that the survey was a deep state conspiracy against suburban values. Judge Holloway listened for about 10 minutes, took off her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and then proceeded to dismantle Brenda's life with a series of sentences that were sharper than any knife. She ruled that the land was indisputably mine, that Brenda had been trespassing for years, that the attempted destruction of the gate was a criminal act, and she issued a permanent restraining order requiring Brenda to stay 50 feet away from me and my property line at all times. But then came the hammer blow. The judge looked at the easement agreement I had offered, the one Brenda ripped up, and asked me if the offer still stood. I stood up, looked at Brenda, who was trembling in her sensible pumps, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, and I thought about it. I thought about the noise, the stress, the drones, the insults, and I said, "Your Honor, the price has gone up. It's now $500 a month for access, aimed at a charity of my choosing, and a public retraction of her statements in the local paper." Brenda gasped, her face going pale, but the judge nodded and said, "That seems reasonable given the harassment the plaintiff has endured," and gave Brenda a choice: accept the terms or lose vehicle access to her home permanently. Brenda signed the paper right there on the table, her hand shaking so hard the pen tore through the page, and she didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone. She just signed her defeat in black ink and walked out of the courtroom alone, because even Ted hadn't shown up to support her. You'd think she would have learned humility, but people like Brenda don't learn, they just relocate blame. So while she paid the money and wrote the apology, which was as stiff and insincere as you'd expect, she stopped coming outside. The blinds in her house were always drawn, and the neighborhood grew quiet, the kind of heavy silence that hangs over a battlefield after the fighting stops. About 2 months later, a for sale sign went up in her yard, and I watched from my porch as the moving trucks arrived, hauling away the furniture, the perfect curtains, and the life she had tried so hard to control. The day she left, I was at the gate, checking the hinges, oiling the mechanism, just basic maintenance, and her car pulled up to the property line, stopping just short of the boundary. She rolled down the window, and for a second, I thought she might say something profound, maybe a final curse or a moment of clarity, but she just looked at the gate, the sentinel, I call it now, and then looked at me with eyes that were tired and empty. "You know," she said, her voice raspy, "it's just a gate, it's just metal." "No, Brenda," I replied, leaning on the bars. "It's a boundary, and some people just don't know where they end and the rest of the world begins until they hit a wall." She rolled the window up without another word and drove away, carefully navigating the strip of driveway she was now renting from me, and disappeared down the road, leaving me alone with the wind and the trees. A nice young couple moved in a few weeks later. They have a golden retriever that plays with Hank and Buster, and the first thing they did was bring over a blueberry pie and ask if the gate bothered me or if I wanted to split the cost of painting it, to which I laughed and told them it was perfect just the way it was. It's been a year now, and sometimes when the fog is thick in the morning, I stand out there with my coffee and look at that iron barrier, thinking about how strange it is that a piece of metal can bring out the absolute worst in a human being, how it stripped away the veneer of civilization and showed the ugly, entitled core underneath. I realized that I didn't win because I was smarter or richer or meaner. I won because I knew where I stood, literally and figuratively, and I respected the lines that divide us. But it makes me wonder, and this is where I leave it to you folks, was I too hard on her? Should I have just let her have the easement for free and save myself the trouble, or is it necessary? In a world that's increasingly full of people who think they can scream their way into getting what they want, to stand firm and lock the gate? Did Brenda deserve to lose her home over a driveway? Or was she the architect of her own exile? Let me know what you think in the comments, because while the court case is closed, the jury of public opinion is always in session, and I have a feeling everyone has met a Brenda at least once in their life. Until next time, keep your fences strong and your property lines clear.